L'kuta Sichos Chelek Yutes Devarim Hey. This is also a siyum a Masechta Avodah Zarah Lil Nishmis Reb Yosef ben Yamin ben Reb Menashe Kaltman. How strong should one be when it comes to inyanim of kashrus or inyanim of frumkeit? The Rabbi teaches us the siyum, the last story in Masechta Avodah Zarah, in a most incredible fashion, and teaches us a very, very profound lesson. This is all going to be based on a pasuk in this week's parsha, which is what the Chachamim based upon the Isser of eating bishulei nachrim, food that, despite the fact that the food is kosher, but it was cooked by someone who is not Jewish, and therefore it becomes prohibited to eat. B'negei Isser from bishulei nachrim, with regards to the prohibition of eating food that was cooked by a Gentile, was me learned up b'derech asmachte von posik oichel bakesef tishbereni v'achalti umayim bakesef titnli v'shasisi. This is learned by way of an asmachta. Asmachta means that this is only a midrabanon. This is not an iser midraisa, but the Chachamim based it or supported themselves with a posik. This is in this week's parsha when Moshe is saying that he told to Sichain Melech HaEmoiri that we'll give you money and you'll give us food, and we'll give you money and you'll give us water to drink. So the V'nista Chachamim learned Mamayim shalei nishtano chulu al yedei ha'ur. Just like water doesn't get changed through fire, if you cook the water, it retains the same look. Af oichel chulu, also food, the only kind of food they would be eating, taking from the Emoirium, first of all, obviously was kosher to food. But even the kosher to food, the only food they could take was food that doesn't get changed by the fire. Which means to say that if you have to cook it and it takes on a new form, then they would not eat that food, because food that was cooked by a goy cannot be eaten. Is da pluked zwischen paskim. So this is clear that there's a Chachamim gave us an iser to eat food that was cooked by a goy. However, there is now a machlekes of the paskim tzidi kelim if the utensils that absorbed within themselves the taste or the residue of that which was cooked by a non-Jew, does that become aser adernit? Which means, if you have food that's not kosher, either it's not kosher meat, or it was mixed milk and meat, and it was cooked in a pot. So clearly the food is not kosher. Not only that, the pot becomes not kosher. And if you put something else that is kosher in the pot and you cook it, then the taste that's in the walls of the pot comes back out into the food, and the food cannot be used. The question is, does the same thing apply to food that's kosher to food, which means to say the ingredients are kosher, but it was cooked or prepared, cooked by the non-Jew? Is that in the poskim vasaltin? There's certain poskim that hold, certain codifiers that hold. The whole reason why we're not allowed to eat food that was cooked by a Gentile is because it leads to mingling and it leads to intermarriage. It could bring to marrying someone who's not Jewish. That's the whole reason. So, but the Chachamim asked the food. They did not prohibit that which is left from the food in the walls of the pot. This would not lead to mingling or to fraternization or to marriage. Meaning to say, if someone who cooks food for you and then brings you the food and you eat it, so this creates a closeness. But if somebody cooks food for you in a pot that someone else cooked food for you, you don't feel any closeness to the original person that cooked. So therefore, there are certain paskim that say that the pleita, that which is left behind in the walls of the pot, is not osir. And therefore the pot itself remains kosher, and if later a yid comes and cooks kosher the food in that pot, you can eat it. However, most of the poskim hold as oich di kelim zayin osir, even the utensils, the pots or so on that were used by the Gentile to cook food in it are also become aser, the kol shasru chachamim, and the reasoning is, despite the fact that there's no issue of chasnus, nevertheless, once the chachamim asered it, pleitasei kamoyu, anything that is left from it, the taste or the residue that is left from it, is as aser as the food itself. That's the reason of those poskim, which means to say is that you're right that there's no issue of chasnus. No, the fact that there's pleita, that there is something left in the pot from an earlier cooking that was done, that would not create any closeness to the person who's eating the food later on. But nevertheless, once the Chachamim asered it and said Bishul Nachrim is aser, then it becomes like the etzem ha'isr, the actual isr, and anything that comes from it retains that isr status. And the Rebbe brings an example from another area in halacha. We can compare this to a situation of wood panels that are 4 tfachim wide, which the Chachamim said they're possible from schach. They can't be used for schach. Why? Because they look like a tikra, they look like a ceiling, they look like a roof. So if we even though the wood is unfinished wood and it comes from the ground, and technically it would be kosher for schach, but once it becomes 4 tfachim wide, it looks like a tikra, it looks like a wall, like a roof, like a ceiling, and Chachamim said it's aser. But the din is, as afilu havchan al tzidayan, even if you turn these panels onto their side, she'ein behen arba, and now the sides don't have four tfachim. Let's say it's a piece of wood, a piece of plywood that's 4 tfachim wide and 3/4 of an inch thick, or 2 inches thick, whatever it is, but not 4 tfachim wide or thick. So now when you turn it over onto its side, it's not covering a space of 4 tfachim. Nevertheless, I say pasul, they are still pasul. Because once they were characterized, once they were identified as pasul, then it's a pasul b'chalin, they become totally not unfit for. They become totally unfit for use, and even if you fiddle with it and you turn it on its side, it's still a cheftzeh shaliser. For this thing, for the Gabi Schach, it becomes a prohibited object. The Rogachover explains this. As das is veil, as zach was is osher mitzad ha'gzeira tzli berander zach. Welcher is osher? If something becomes osher as a gzeira, the Chachamim came and they prohibited something because it leads to something else, because it's like something else that's osher. In this case, tikra. The 4 tvachim wood panel is aser because the tikra is aser, the rooftop, the ceiling is aser. What happens is this object becomes like the original iser. This 4 tvachim board becomes like a ceiling. And therefore, not only if the reason is there, then you can't use it, but it becomes considered like a ceiling, and it can't be used. Similarly, we can apply this to our situation of something that was cooked by a Gentile into a pot, and now the pot retained the taste of that, the residue of that into its walls. Even though the reason why we don't allow a person to eat bishulei nachrim is because of chasnus, because it might lead to intermarriage. But once Chacham said it's aser, it becomes like the original iser, like anything else that would be totally prohibited. And therefore the iser is still applicable even when the chashash of chasnus, the fear of intermarriage doesn't exist. Like in the case of the plata, like in the case of the pot that has in its walls a bishul. So here's another example in halacha where you see. So what do we have over here? We have there's a machlekes haposkim whether platas bishul akum, that which is left in the pot, if it's aser or not, which means a pot that was used for bishul akum is the pot aser, and some poskim say no because there's no chashash chasnus. Most poskim say that yes, it's a problem because even though there's no chashash chasnus, because of the fact that once Chacham said it's aser, it becomes aser entirely, even that which is left behind from it. And the Rebbe brought an example from Nisarim where we see that something that is aser retains its iser even in the case where the iser doesn't, where the reason doesn't apply. In Sif Beis, the Rabbi is going to introduce us to the siyum of Masechta Avodah Zarah. It's very interesting. This in Fabrengen, Yudas Kislev Tosh Lamed Aleph. It's actually on tape, and it's very, very gishmak. I highly recommend it to take some time and listen to it. Even though the Sikha is an hour long, but the last 25 minutes are about Miu Yehudi. It's only about 30-35 minutes in which the Rebbe teaches this Sikha as it is. Very, very gishmak. So the Rebbe said in the Fabrengen, he said that he's never before made, at least publicly, I guess, a siyum Masechta Avodah Zarah, and therefore Yudas Kislev, which is a time where Chassidim are Messiahim the Shas. So the Rebbe is going to make a siyum a Masechta Avodah Zarah. So, and the Rebbe is going to use this story in the end of Avodah Zarah to prove shita of the Reva Poskim that pleitas bishulakum, that which is left in the utensils from that which was used or cooked by a goy, becomes aser and not just the food itself. So let's take this one step at a time. Yeshleimar a mocker to the day from the Reva Poskim. We can say that here we have a mocker, a source to the opinion of most of the Poskim from the Sipur was very gebracht and see Masechta Aveda Zara, from the story that is brought at the very end of Masechta Aveda Zara, bekesher zum din wie man darf kasher and asakin from Giyulei Nachrim, with regards to the din of kashering a knife that was used in the process of cooking by a non-Jew, lechel botzeinen, to eat cold. Let's just explain what this means, lechel botzeinen. If you're using a knife that has in it Giyulei Nachrim, which, by the way, this is lav dafka just bishalakum. This can be also something that has in it treif. A guy cooked in it, so we don't know if it's kosher today. If we have a knife, now if you want to use it for hot food, we have to kasher it through hagala, through boiling water, and even that, sometimes with a knife there's complications. But in this case, the Gemara is talking about if you want to eat something cold with it, you want to cut an apple with a knife, so you still have to kasher it, but you don't need hagala. Over there, the Gemara is talking about sticking it into the ground 10 times. The pressure of putting it into the ground, it rubs off any of the shamnunis, any residue that's on the outside of the knife, and it also will remove that which is the first layer or so that is on the inside of the knife. So if you're using the knife for cold, the Gemara over there in the end of the Avodah is saying that the way to kasher it is by sticking it in the ground 10 times. As it is from Sakin is give them mitzat bishulei nachrim. If we're going to learn pshat in that story, that the isser of the knife that we're going to speak about is not because there was treifus in there, but because there was it was just because it was used by a goy to cook or to prepare food. That in itself will answer a number of questions that we have on the story, and obviously that's a proof that bishul akum, the kalim, the utensils that were used for bishul akum, bishul nachrim, is problematic. So again, there's a story which we're about to learn, which talks about kashering a knife, and the story is going to raise a number of questions. And if we say that the issue over there was not that a knife wasn't kosher, mitzat kosher ingredients, but the problem was the knife was used for Giyulei Nachrim, for that it was used in the cooking of a non-Jew, that will answer our questions, and obviously this will prove that the knife becomes becomes unfit for use because of the fact that it was used by a Gentile in their cooking. And this is the words of the Gemara. Mar Yehuda ubati bartuvi. Mar Yehuda, which as we'll see later in the Sikha, some say is Rav Yehuda, a great Amoida, ubati bartuvi, and Bati Bartuvi, who was, as we'll see later in the Sikha, was an Eved, or had been an Eved, and they were together. They were sitting together with Shavur Malka. Shavur Malka was a king of Paras, a Persian king. He was not Jewish, but again, as we will see in the Sikha, he was very well learned, even in the halachas of Yiddishkeit. So as they're sitting there, somebody brought before the king a cooked esrog. Pasak, so the king sliced off a piece, ochal, and he ate it. Pasak, then he sliced off another piece. V'havle lebati bartuvi, and he gave Bati Bartuvi a piece. And obviously, as we'll see from the continuation of the Sikha, obviously Bati Bartuvi ate the piece. Hodor dotza asara zimni biara. Then the king gets up and he sticks the knife into the ground 10 times, which is what the Gemara is saying over there, that in order to kasher a knife, then you have to stick it into the ground 10 times. Pasak, and then he sliced off another piece of the esrog. Havle le Mar Yehuda, and he gave it to Mar Yehuda. Omar le Bati Bartuvi. So now Bati Bartuvi says to the king, Vahu Gavra Lav Bar Yisrael, who is this guy, meaning himself, not a Yid. Why is it that for me you gave me a piece of the esrog from your knife, and for the Mar Yehuda you kashered the knife before giving him a piece? Omar Lay, we're going to see over the Gemara has two versions of what the Shvur Malka answered. Omar, the first one is that he said, Mar, Kim Li Begavei. Mar Yehuda, I know him. I know who he is. Umar Li Kim Li Begavei, but you, I don't know who you are. And Rashi explains, Rav Yehuda Makirani Baisha Uparush. Rav Yehuda, I know that he's scrupulous. He's very careful to stay away from and he would never eat something that was prohibited. But you, I don't know that you'll be so careful, so scrupulous. And therefore, I had no reason to kasha the knife. Another version in the Gemara as to what Shvur Malka answered to Bati Bartuvi. Amar Lei said, remember what you did last night, yesterday in the evening. And Rashi explains that it was the way of the Persian hosts to give to their guests female companionship for the night. And when they were sent these female companions for the night, Kibel Bati accepted her into his room. And Rav Yehuda said, no, thank you. He didn't accept. So we see that Bati spent the night with a Persian woman. And obviously, says Shvur Malka to Bati, if this is the kind of person you are, obviously, I don't expect you to be careful with what you eat. Now, let it be pashtus on a basic level. Is there a chilek between these two man da Omaris and the effort from Shvur Malka in them? What is the difference between the two opinions in what Shvur Malka's answer was? But late in the first answer, he was saying he wasn't sure. I don't know if you are careful to refrain from prohibited things. But according to the second opinion, he was certain. He was confident that this person is not careful to refrain from prohibition, because I know what you did last night. I know that last night you engaged in a prohibited thing, in a prohibited act. The fee says nicht verstandig, but based on this, there is a question. Since Bati accepted the women and clearly transgressed on a prohibition, why, according to the first opinion, does Shvur Malka express a lack of knowledge? I don't know what's going on with you. And it's clearly a stretch to say that they're arguing in reality if it actually happened or not. If it actually happened that Bati Bartuvi had accepted these women guests and spent the night with them. Clearly, it happened. The question is what was Shvur Malka saying about it? So the question that we have now is, if Shvur Malka knows that it happened, why does he sort of pretend like he doesn't know what kind of person Bati Bartuvi is? He clearly does know. So that's the first question that we have. What, according to the first opinion, what does the Shvur Malka mean? I don't know if you are someone that refrains from transgression, from prohibition. Now, in Sif Gimel, the Rebbe is going to introduce that it's actually a machlekes Rashi and Tosfos whether Bati actually transgressed a sin over here. And the reason for that is that Bati Bartuvi was an Eved that had been released by his master, an Eved Knaini, that was released by his master, but because he was too arrogant, the Lashon in the Gemara, B'ramois Rucha, because he was too arrogant, he did not accept the get shichrur, the document of release. And the halacha is just like by a husband and a wife, if the woman did not take the get, the actual document of the get, she is not divorced and she cannot remarry. An eved who doesn't get his get shichrur is not a is not uis eved, does not lose his classification of being an eved. Now, according to Tosfos, this means that he's allowed to lie with a non-Jewish woman because he's not yet a yid. And we'll see that Rashi disagrees. But according to Tosfos, it's going to imply that Bati did nothing wrong, because since he was an Eved, or an Eved Ktsas, as we're going to call it, as the Gemara calls it, he was an Eved Ktsas, he was still partially an Eved, there was nothing wrong with what he did. Okay. In Taisus state, as Bati had nit chetek when der mitvas er nekabel when the nashon nachri, Taisus explains that Bati did not commit a sin, a crime, by accepting these non-Jewish women. But there is given an eved ktsas shem ukev get shichur. He was still a partial eved. He had not yet received his bill of release. I think in English it's called a manumission. When an eved is mutar b'shanachris, and an eved is permitted to be with a Gentile woman, and therefore, since he's still an eved, he didn't do anything wrong. V'yesh leimar. Now the Rebbe is going to say that this machlekes Rashi Teisves. Rashi was bavoren nit as boti is der mitnit bagayin kinisar. Rashi says nothing of the sort. Rashi on this Gemara doesn't say that boti didn't do anything wrong. Why? So Rashi, which does not say anything, and Teisvis that says that he did nothing wrong, are arguing according to their shita, according to their approach, which they have elsewhere. There's a Gemara in Gittin, that a person says, I despair, I give up on my Eved. The Eved had gone missing, and he said, I give up on him, which basically means that he's releasing him, but he didn't give him a get shikhr because he's nowhere to be found. So the Gemara says, the only rectification, the only way he could go on with his life is with a shtar. So it's Rashi Mefarish. Rashi explains, Ein letakana, which means there's nothing for him to do. Bebas Yisrael, he can't marry a Yid, a Jew, because he's still an Eved. And nor can he marry a Shivcha, which an Eved Knan is allowed to do, but he can't do it because he's partially released. When the owner said Nisya Ashti, he released him. And therefore he is in a limbo. He's not anymore an Eved, and he's not yet a Yid. Ober Tesis Dart, over there in Gittin Tesis says, let it need Rashi. Does not to say like Rashi, nor as the only thing that he can't do is marry a Yid. But he is allowed to marry a Shivcha, because Tesis holds that he's still considered an Eved. Well, Derek says, similarly, this would apply to Bati in our situation, was his given get who had not yet received his manumission. As Ladas Rashi is it Asher B'Shivcha. Rashi holds Asher B'Shivcha is not allowed to marry a Shivcha, and therefore, at the same token, is not allowed to marry or be with, rather, or spend the night with a Gentile woman. However, Tesis holds that Bati is still an Eved, even though he's lacking against Shichrur. But even though he's still an Eved Ktsas, but because he doesn't have a get Shichrur, he's therefore allowed to be with a Shivcha, and he's therefore allowed to be with a Nachris, with a Gentile woman. And the night before, when he accepted the guest, the companionship from the Persian hosts, he didn't do anything wrong. However, now this raises a different question. Is it move on like Pirishat Teisves? But now we have another question. If Bati did not commit a crime, why does Shvur throw at him? Oh, I know what you did last night. Doesn't matter. What he did last night was perfectly okay. So that's why we have a question now. Now we wanted to understand what's going on. Why does Shvur say Kim le begavo? So the Rebbe introduced the Teisves, who according to Teisves, Bati did nothing wrong. But then the question is, in that case, then what's Shvur Malka telling him? You did something wrong last night. You didn't do anything wrong. Now, the Ritva is Masbir. The Ritva holds, Shvur Malka le'ideyasa. Shvur Malka did not know the halacha that an Eved is mutter b'shivcha. Uleficha chashadaisa. And therefore, Shvur Malka suspected. So just like he wasn't careful from spending the night with a Gentile woman, he won't care about eating food that was cooked by a guy. But it's not true. Because the Eved is commanded to keep all Yisurim. Meaning to say he's allowed to be with a Shivcha, but other types of Yisurim, when it comes to food, he is commanded to keep. And just like he's not allowed to eat pig or meat that was not slaughtered properly, he's also not allowed to eat food that was cooked by someone who isn't a Yid. So this is what the Ritva says, that Shvur didn't know the din. But this is not a fully satisfying explanation. Shvur Malki is doch given a baki bedinim. Shvur Malki was someone who was very well versed in dinim. The Gemara in Endabab Mitzvah brings that Ephraim Safra was the Talmud of Reish Lakish, said to Reish Lakish, Halacha Kirib Shimon. Then when they repeated this over to Shvur Malka, he said, Afarye Namte, which means he deserves to be praised, which means that what he said was truthful. It was talking what the halacha is like. And Rashi says, and Tosfos also says the same thing, that Shvur Malka was baki b'halachis. As a matter of fact, Tosfos brings a raya from our Gemara in Avodah Zarah that the fact that Shvur Malka knew to stick the knife into the ground 10 times is in itself a proof. And the Rabbi says, "We says Muchach Eich from the Sugya Gufa," as we see from the Sugya that Shvur Malka knew the halachas. Is it doesn't really make sense to say that he didn't know this din. If he's baki b'dinim and he knows how to kasher a knife, so he probably knows this din as well. It's also difficult to say that he didn't know that Bati was still partially an Eved. Rabbi Yehuda announced about this. There's a Gemara in Kiddushin where it says, Machlis Rabbi Yehuda b'pum b'disa. Rabbi Yehuda made various announcements about various different people and their yuchsin and their kosher status. And one of the things he said was, Bati bar Tuvi b'ramis rucha l'shakal kita d'cheirisa. That Bati bar Tuvi is so arrogant that he didn't take his get shikhr. And the Gemara lost his Machlis Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda made an announcement out of it. So to say that Shvur Malka didn't know this is difficult to say. So Shvur Malka knew that he wasn't Eved Kitzas, and Shvur Malka knew that the halacha is that an Eved, according to Tosfos, that an Eved is muter b'shivcha. If him came, we have a question. What's Shvur Malka saying? I know what you did last night. If seemingly what he did the night before was not problematic at all for him. In Sif Daled, the Rebbe is going to ask additional questions. And the primary question is going to be, three different questions, but the gist of the questions is going to be, even if you don't know how from a Bati Bar Tuvi is, why purposely cause him to transgress more? And why not try to figure out a way that, if you're figuring it out for Yehuda, why not figure it out for Bati as well? That's going to be the general gist of the questions. Also, first of all, in this next paragraph, the Rebbe is going to answer why did Bati take it. If Bati cared, and he asks Shvur Malka, "What? I'm not a Jew." So, in that case, why did he eat it? So that's the Rebbe is going to answer that right away. The fact that Bati took the slice of esrig, and the fact that he ate it, as it seems from the context of the story, can be explained very simply. It's not because he wasn't careful to not eat food that was cooked by a guy, or because he didn't know the din. From the fact that he asked indignantly of Shvur Malka, "What? I'm not a Yid." Is moving as gewusst. He knew the halacha, and it upset him that he was given this slice of esrig. So in that case, why did he eat it? Nor if he does not eat that which the king gives him, this would make him guilty of treason. And now he's putting himself in danger of his life. He could be killed for treason. Which pikuach nefesh is deicha the whole Torah. So to not take this slice of esrig is a matter of life and death, and therefore he's allowed to take it. In the Farbrengen, where the Rebbe is talking about this, the Rebbe brings an example from the Gemara Masechta Megillah, that Haman told Achashverosh, how terrible are the Yidden, that if they find a zvuv, a fly, in a cup of wine, they'll take out the zvuv, they'll take out the fly, and they'll drink the wine. But if the king, Achashverosh, pours them a cup of wine, they're not going to drink it. It's yain nesach. And therefore, Haman was trying to prove to Achashverosh that they were rebels, that they were not accepting the kingship of Achashverosh. From this, we see that not taking a drink that a king gave you is medidim malchus. And therefore, similarly over here, if Shvur Malka gave Bati a slice of esrig, not eating it, not taking it and eating it, is medidim malchus. Vein Cyril is aber kmuvan, was nachdem wir hat gesehen, as für Malka verhit my Yehuda von der Devarim hat gefragt, wo Gabra Lav bar Yisrael. And it's not a stira from the fact that later he opens his mouth and says, "What, am I not Jewish?" Why didn't you take care of me as well, that I should also get the kosher a slice of esrig? Because after it happened and after he sees that he's careful about it, he could inquire why he did it this way. But in the moment when it's being given to him, to not take it is clearly an act of rebellion against the king and is a matter of life and death. So why Bati took the slice and why he ate it, we understand why. He had no choice. As but from the perspective of Svur Malka, there remains some questions. Since clearly Svur Malka was not trying to cause someone to transgress something that is prohibited, is Sidar Farva said is Nitkiven Zicher Lekimle Begavei, as Bati is a punishment of Isser. So just because he wasn't certain, he didn't know for sure that how scrupulous Bati is, it is maspek as Bavade Machshal and Geber Essen and Isser. Is that enough to give him a certain something that's certainly prohibited for him? Let's say in the first answer of the Gemara, he said, I don't know you. I don't know what you're holding in life. So therefore, what? You're going to jump to give him something that's also for him? Base. Even according to the Ikar Damri, that Bati committed a crime. Either Rashi, according to Rashi, actually did something that was asir, or according to Teisvis, that what he did wasn't really wrong, but Shvur Malka obviously thought that he did do something wrong. Let's maybe use the shita of the Ritva that he didn't know, even though we asked on that. But let's say Shvur Malka obviously thought he did something wrong. That doesn't create a reason to cause him to transgress another prohibition. It could be that Bati could not withstand the incredible temptation of sinning with the Gentile woman. But he's still careful about not eating non-kosher food. Especially if it's nus, if it's being promiscuous with someone who you're not in a way of marriage, but just in a one-night situation, and nobody knows about it, it's betzina, it's only with the rabbanon. In other words, the isim deraisa would be, and this is obviously a much broader topic, but it would be when there's a chasnus and when it's something that everybody knows about. But here it was a guest that someone was sent to him, and it was just a one-time thing. So the Rabbanon Ugili Nachrim, to eat something from a goy that might be not kosher is an ism in. Again, at this point, we're not talking about bishul akum. We're talking about using their kelim that have in them maybe chazer or machalas asuris or prohibited foods, and that's also in. So the question is that just because he did something wrong the night before doesn't mean that this is a green light to now say, oh, he doesn't keep kosher anymore. Especially since the food is awesome in as the Rebbe explains. And what he did last night might have just been a Rabbanon. The question goes deeper. Since anyway Shvur Malka was sticking the knife into the ground for Mar Yehuda. He could have done it a few minutes earlier. Before he gave Bati to eat from the Esrik. And that would have protected Bati from committing this Isser. Why does he wait until after he gives the Esrik to Bati and only then put the knife into the ground as and thus making Bati actually specifically eat something that's awesome? So these are our questions. Why Bati took it, we know why, because it was an Indian that he was afraid for his life. But why does Shvur Malka not do it any earlier, putting the knife into the ground? And why would he think that just because Bati did something wrong the night before, therefore he could do more things wrong? And according to the first opinion of the Gemara, he says, "Lekimle begavei," I don't know you. Just because you don't know the person doesn't mean you could jump to the conclusion that he's going to do something that is aser. And according to Tesis, what does he even mean when he says Itker, my dahave be'urta? Remember what happened last night. If there wasn't even anything wrong to it if it wasn't even anything wrong to begin with. And the Sifei, the Rebbe is going to give a beer, and the Rebbe is going to say that number one, we have to establish that we're talking about the Isra of Bishul Akum, not of Bishul Nachrim, not the Isra of Machalas Asuris. The issue is not that this knife had non-kosher food on it. The only issue with this knife was that it was cooked, it was used to cook by someone who wasn't Jewish. And And as we'll see that I've explained, because if it's machalas asuris, then as you'll see in the answer, these questions are all very, very powerful questions that don't get answered. And point number two is, now that we are introducing that the issue here is bishul akum. From this we can conclude that kalim, the sakin of bishul akum, is osir, and that is a raya to the Reva Poskim, like the Rebbe began at the beginning of the Sikha. But here's the beer. The Isser here of this knife was not because of forbidden foods. Was said that it would have absorbed by being used in the kitchen in the home of Shvur Malka for Rum. And the Rebbe says a very, very practical explanation. Since Shvur Malka is a king, is there anything lacking in the house of the king? It's a place of grandeur, of abundance. Es hat nicht keiner zu sagen, als zu schneiden Peiris Eslig, man genutzt das Sacken mit welchen man sich benutzt für Tafshili Basar Teach v'chulu. It's hard to say that they were using the same knife to cut an Eslig that had earlier been used to cook hot meat, cooked meat. Even today, when you talk to any professional chef, they will tell you that they have a whole set of knives, and you can't cut a tomato with a steak knife, and you can't cut a piece of meat with a knife that's been meant for bread. Every type of food has its own knife. Certainly in the house of a king, there was for fruit, it had its own specific knives. So this knife that Shvur Malka is using for the Esrig certainly was never used for meat or for anything that was usher. No, their sakin has been also mitzvah b'shul nachrim. The problem with a knife to begin with is the fact that it was used for cooking by someone who was not Jewish. The knife was used for cooking fruit, even sharp fruit, which make the kashrus of the knife more problematic. And the knife absorbed from something that was inherently kosher but used in the cooking of a non-Jew. Alpiza is moving the roof to Iked Amri. Now we understand what the Iked Amri is saying. As from Alkot gesagt, the Shmuelka says, I know what happened last night. The Tama Iser from Bishul Nachrim is Kanal Mishum Chasnos B'nei Seyan. The whole reason why we asked cooking of a goy is because it might lead to marrying their daughters. But if Bati is permitted to be with their daughters, then the entire Isser doesn't apply. The whole reason why it became Usser is for something that's not even Usser for him. So this is an incredible way of understanding this Gemara. He's not saying he did something wrong. He's saying, look at you. You're a person that does not have the Isser of Bnei Seyan, of marrying the daughters of the Gentiles. If you have no issue with that, then you certainly have no issue of eating something that they cooked that might lead to marrying their daughters. Now, the Rebbe is going to clarify something here, because in the beginning of the Sikha we said that once Chacham said it's Osir, it becomes Kimoy Etzem HaIsr. It becomes like the actual Isr, and the reasonings don't apply. Which means that even if by the plate that we said earlier, there's no issue of chasnas, doesn't matter. Chacham asad, chacham asad. So the chayre, why over here are we changing it? So the Rebbe is going to explain that. Even though we said in the beginning of earlier in Sif Aleph that the Isser of Bishul by a Gentile, it becomes like the very definition of Isser. When the fire bleibt there, with the time of Isser at bottle, and therefore the Isser remains even in a place where the reasoning doesn't apply. That can be compared. In other words, if you're talking about a regular Yid that's eating food that was cooked in a pot that has in it bishul akum, or plate of bishul akum in the walls, so you can't compare that to Bati Bartuvi, who melachatchila the Isser never began. Is levad zois. Varum levad zois. First of all, was the klal for nasik mayatzim Isser. This rule that bishul akum becomes like the very definition of the Isser. Only really works if you're talking about something specific. Since it already has the status of something that is possible, like the neser, like the wooden panel for the schach, then it remains in every case, even on its plata, even on that which comes out of it. But in those instances where seichel, where logic tells you that the Isser never even began to begin with, because the whole reasoning doesn't apply here. We find by Bishul Nachrim itself, as that the Issa doesn't apply. Because to begin with, there was never an issue of chasnas with them, of intermingling, of intermarriage. For example, foods that are not chashiv, like the lashon we use is eila shulchan malachim, foods that are not important enough to be used on the king's table. The Isser of Bishul Akum doesn't apply. Why? Because since you don't feel close to another person just because he cooked you something, some cheap food, so therefore Chacham said that the issue of chasnas doesn't begin, and therefore it's mutter. So even though Bishul Akum is a problem and not Sikim Hayatzim Isser, but if it's not Eila Shulchan Malachim, then it never became Asr in the first place, because the Isser of chasnas never applied here. So another example, which is not really lahalacha, but there's certain opinions that say that a guy that's working in a Jewish home, the Bishul Akum doesn't apply. That's not the halacha. But the reason why they would say that is because when he's working for the Yid in his home, there's no problem of chasnas. At least according to those opinions. But I'm just using it as an example. It's not the halacha, but it's using the example that certain things that did not have in them Isra of chasnas to begin with, Chachamim were in geyser there. So once Chachamim are geyser something, then it remains there in every instance, even if the chasnas doesn't apply. But if the Chachamim were in geyser there because there's no Isra chasnas there, then you're not going to say that it's aser. Is naisif lazeh, but on top of that, even if this is different, but here it's even stronger the fact that the Isser shouldn't apply. The fact that we said earlier that an Isser remains even when the reason doesn't exist, meint nor, as I said, the talking chashas the bishuli nachem can difference from Isser chasnas. Aber the Isser chasnas is dort voran. What happens in that case of, let's say, the Plata? The problem of chasnos is still there. The Yid is not allowed to marry the guy. The only thing is, we're saying that in the Plata, in the residue, there's no Isser chasnos. So that makes sense. Since the problem of chasnas exists in idea. So even though this specific pot is not going to cause chasnos, but we said that once it becomes aser, it becomes aser. Masheke didn't done by bati. But in the case of bati, the whole Isser chasnos doesn't exist. In other words, previously we were saying that this won't lead to chasnas. Here we're saying the chasnas doesn't exist. That it doesn't make sense to say that the chasnos itself is permitted. So the aser, das bishul nachem is can refer to chasnos, but we should still aser the cooking of the guy because it might lead to chasnos, it might lead to intermarriage. Intermarriage is okay. It's not intermarriage. He's an eved. So there's two nukudas over here. Number one, this never received the shem psul. Never received, it was never identified as something that was a problem. Number two, we're talking about a person that the whole concept of chasnas doesn't exist. Just like you would say that a goy is allowed to eat bishul akum, but he was an eved. An eved in this aspect is the same thing. He's allowed to be and marry or live with bnei sayan, the daughters of the goyim. Now, so this is the pshat in the Gemara, that Shvur Malchus says to Bati, since you are with Bnei Sayan, since you spent the night with Bnei Sayan, clearly this is something that you hold, that you're doing, that you're being with Bnei Sayan. If you're with Bnei Sayan, then certainly you're not going to be zahir in bishul or giuleyan in their cooking, because the whole problem with the cooking is only because of chasnas, and chasnas is not an issue for you. Once we go down this road, that the focusing on the connection between the bishul nachri and chasnos, we can even understand Rashi. As Bati is ben asa ben achris, even according to Rashi, that Bati was prohibited from being with this Gentile. Chotzer is given an Eved Ktsas, even though he was only a partial Eved. Even though he was still an Eved, nevertheless he was still Asr because he was only a partial Eved. As it is for Bishul Nachrim is not Shvetin from Bnei Seiyan, since the whole purpose of Bishul Nachrim is to protect the person from falling or succumbing to the daughters. Hat gehalten, Shvur Malka felt, as es Nitak in Tam Va'echert zu Isut Batim from the Mesiog to Misa Bnei Seiyan. There's no reason to make sure that Bati is careful of this Siog, of this buffer, to the issue of marrying Bnei Seiyan, since he himself doesn't care about it. So in other words, according to Rashi, Bati committed a crime, committed an Isser. He was with a Goya. But Shvur Malka says, I understand that if it was any other Isser, I would accept that you're probably still careful with it. But this one Isser of Bishul Akum can't be a problem for you. Because the whole reason why Bishul Akum is a problem is because of chasnus, and since you're not being careful with chasnus, obviously you're not going to be careful with the siyag to chasnus, with a fence, with a buffer to chasnus. So this is the pshat in the Gemara. In the Ikad Amri, according to Teisvis, Shvur Malka is saying that there's no the Bishul Akum doesn't apply because this person is mutter b'chasnus. According to Rashi, even though Bishul Akum does apply, but Shvur Malka does not expect Bati to care about it, since he doesn't care about chasnus either. In Sivav, we're going to go back to the first Mandamer in the Gemara. As you remember, we asked, why is he saying Kim le begaveh? I don't know you, if he knows what he did. So Sivav, the Rabbi is going to explain. Why does Shvur Malka not bring up the fact of what happened the night before, according to the first Mandamar? So the Rebbe introduces the fact that Be'etzem, there is more than one reason why we don't eat Bishul Nachrim. Besides for this above mentioned reason, that we don't eat that which was cooked by a non-Jew because it might lead to intermarriage. There's another reason. That a yid shouldn't be too comfortable eating with a goy because he might end up giving him something that's not kosher. If you get too comfortable eating together, you might end up eating something. You say, I eat this, you eat this, and then one day he'll pass him something that was actually prepared for himself and it's not kosher, and he might end up eating something that's not kosher. So according to this, we could say, as the zwei man der Amar in Gemara, seine verbunden mit die zwei Teimen, that these two opinions in the Gemara and our Gemara about what Shvur Malka answered to Bati Bartuvi are connected with these two reasons why Bishul Nachrim is a problem. And they're arguing which of these two reasons is the primary reason for the prohibition of Bishul Nachrim. Leighton Ikeda Amri is that Tam Ikri Mishum Chasnus. According to the second opinion, the main reason why we don't eat Bishul Nachrim is because of Chasnus, because it might lead to intermarriage. And therefore, when Shvur Malka reminds Bati what happened the night before, it answers why we don't have to protect him from the Bishul Nachrim. Either that's what Teisvis al mutter b'nei Seiyan. Either according to Teisvis, because Bati is allowed to marry the daughters of the Nachrim. Or that's Rashi, or like we said, according to Rashi, because he anyways is not careful in this, and therefore clearly he's not going to be careful in the food. Aber Leighton Ersten Lashon, according to the first opinion in the Gemara, is that Tam Ikri, the main reason why we don't eat Bishul Nachrim, is Shalei Yisrael Ragil v'chul v'yachlenet avitameh, so that a Yid shouldn't be too comfortable around the non-Jew and end up eating something that's not kosher. Und the Gabe Dem Chshash is an Inyan from the Baal Geburt and it can enter. And for this concern, the fact that he might eat something that's not kosher, what happened the night before, it doesn't address that. So they can say, I know what happened the night before. Because it doesn't matter. There's still another problem. Even if the chasnos isn't an issue, there's still a problem that we don't eat Bishul Nachrim because it might lead us to eat something that's not kosher. And that's why Shvur Malka does not use that as an answer, and instead he uses the answer, I didn't know. I'm sorry, I didn't know. I didn't know where you're holding in life, and I didn't know. As bleibt aber nicht verstandig, however, this is not a sufficient answer. Genau, mit Neshman Omar, Via Zeish for Malkas Taina Lekim de Begavea Berechtigung zu Machshos ein Boti mit Anis Dvarisser. How does his not knowing justify causing him to sin with something that's prohibited? Yeah, he didn't know. So, as we say in English, you err to the side of caution. Be extra careful. Now, going back to the second opinion, we have another question. The Shitas Rashi. And it's true that according to Rashi, Bati was not careful to not be with the daughters of the Gentiles. There's no necessity to protect him from Bishul Nachrim, which is only a buffer to only a protection for the Isser of intermarriage. But still, it would have been better than to put the knife into the ground before he cuts the esek far botin. And thus he will protect him. He'll keep him away from an iser. There's no tircha involved. There's no extra work. He's anyway going to stick the knife into the ground. Is there beer in them? And here the Rebbe introduces another beer, another very beautiful idea that might have been unexpected. Their din is as a parnish and ismana al tzibur, someone that becomes a leader over the community. Tarnit tan ki malacha b'fnei shleisha is not allowed to do malacha, is not allowed to go in public and do work because it's not respectful. Because and certainly by a king. And even though Shvur Malka himself wasn't Jewish, is doch the halacha. But still, it's something that makes sense that in order to retain the dignity of the king, he shouldn't go be doing manual labor in front of his constituents. And this reasoning applies even if the king is not Jewish. Certainly, the king, as he refers to himself, is certainly not going to disrespect himself by going to do manual labor in front of people. And in general, we are, as Yidden, are obligated to respect even the non-Jewish kings. And the reason is simple. Because honoring the king is necessary for the habitation, for the safety of the world. Because if not for the fear of the government, people would eat each other up alive. And for that, Yeshuvah Shalom, Tikkun Olam, is something that even non-Jews are obligated to keep. So if they're obligated to keep this mitzvah of Yeshuvah Shalom, then a Yid is obligated to honor the king who is providing Yeshuvah Shalom, providing safety and the ability to inhabit the world in a proper way. So Shvur Malka is a king, and therefore there is a din that he's not allowed to engage in manual labor, in regular malacha, in front of people. Kum tois as mitzat kved melech hat Shvur Malka nit getort neit zayn dem sakim bekarka. So now this means that because of the dignity of the king, Shvur Malka was not allowed to stick the knife into the ground. Bifnei Bati Mariyud in front of them. Since when Bati eats the esrik, without the king having to have stuck it into the ground 10 times, he is not committing an isser. As we said earlier, quite the contrary. He is obligated to eat this piece of esrig, because otherwise it's an issue of pikuach nefesh, a matter of life and death. Therefore, Shvur Malka was obligated to give him the esrik without putting it into the ground, because he's not allowed to put it in the ground. So then in that case, why does he do it for Mar Yehuda? There's bara from Shvur Malka for Mar Yehuda. But according to this, we can understand why Shvur Malka does put the knife into the ground for Mar Yehuda. Velmar kimle begavei, because I know him. He wasn't saying that I know that Mar Yehuda would not eat an Isser, and Bati I don't know what he's going to do. Nor kimle begavei, I know him so well as Mar Yehuda that b'shum eifin nites in the mesrik. The Mar Yehuda will in no way, shape, or form will he eat this esrig Even though halachically he's allowed to eat it because it's a matter of pekuach nefesh. I feel it when it's verbunden mit pekuach nefesh, but I know that Mar Yehuda would not eat the esrig, even though it's a matter of life and death. Especially if you say that Mar Yehuda is also Rav Yehuda, and the Gemara in Brachis says, within the Gemara it says that somebody asked why by the earlier generations they see open miracles and we don't see open miracles. And he was referring to Rav Yehuda, was one of the people that was from the previous generation that had seen many miracles. So the Gemara answers that Rav Yehuda was from the Kamoi, was from the earlier ones, was Havokamasru Nafshayu Akdus Hashem, that sacrificed their life for the Akdus Hashem. A few of them is nitmechuyev in them, even for something they weren't obligated to do. The Gemara brings some examples of where they put their own ruchnis, their own spirituality at risk in order to do something for the Eibishter. So therefore, especially if this is the same Rav Yehuda, Shvur Malka knows that Rav Yehuda will at no way, shape, or form eat this piece of esrik. Therefore, Shvur Malka had no choice. If he wants to get him to eat, he knows that even though he's allowed to eat it, he's not going to. The only way to get him to eat it is to put it into the ground, and therefore he has no choice. In order 49, the Rebbe adds very beautiful ha'ara, and he says, he's not allowed to give up on his own kavod. And not only that, we know that it says that the melech shemachlal kvoide ein kvoide machal, a king cannot forego on his own kavod, because it says shem tasim alecha melech shetehei mosei alecha. There has to be the fear of the people, the fear of the king on the people, and therefore a king is not allowed to be moichel on his kavod. But the Rebbe says over there that if he's doing it in order to avoid someone, to avoid a person committing an iser, that is not considered heipech hakavod. And the Rebbe refers to mitzvah shiny. Over there the Gemara asked that Agrippas HaMelech, that he stood when he read the Torah in the year of Hakel, and which was considered, a king is supposed to sit, and he stood. It was considered a heipech hakavod. So the Gemara asked, it says that the Chachamim praised him. So how could he praise him if he did something that was disrespectful? And the Gemara answers mitzvah shiny. If he was doing it for the sake of the mitzvah, therefore it was different, and he's allowed to be meichel al kvodo. Similarly over here, since Shvur Malka was doing this in order to hold, in order that Rav Yehuda, Mar Yehuda, should not commit an iser, that's not considered heipech hakavod of the king. So in the case, Mashiach about Bati was likim lebegavei, and it was super nitzi as bechal paras for nisurim. Nor blessing Bati was chmeis nefesh and of them. In the case of Bati, where the king doesn't know him, not he doesn't know if he's careful for misurim. He believes he is, but he doesn't know whether he doesn't know if he's going to be meis nefesh for this. Shvur Malka was not allowed. For someone that he doesn't know for sure if he's going to be Mesa Nefesh or not, he's not allowed to undignify himself by putting the knife into the ground. But for Mar Yehuda, who he knew for certain would be Mesa Nefesh for this, here his kavod he was able to put his kavod aside and put the knife in the ground 10 times. In order 50, the Rebbe answers one last question. Why couldn't he just switch the order? Why couldn't he feed Rav Yehuda first and put the knife into the ground for Rav Yehuda, and then Bati could eat after that, and that way automatically the knife would be kosher? And the Rebbe answers because Shvur Malka wanted us to learn from this. He wanted us to learn this din that for a person like Bati, for a person that is not ready to be Meiser Nefesh for this food, to not eat this food, you're not allowed. The king is usher to forego on his kavod. And this ties in. Even without this, but especially this ties in to the hira, the lesson that Rebbe takes from the story in Sivches. From the Sipurot Bnei Chayidon of Hashem, there's a very powerful lesson here. The story is about two people who were sitting in front of the king, both of whom were obligated to honor the king. One of them is given in Shrek by the Nididish Melech, was in fear of this non-Jewish king. Und der Pharao hat gegessen von dem Pri, was Shvur Malka hat geschnitten mit nicht kosher Saken. And therefore he ate from the fruit that Shvur Malka cut with a non-kosher knife. Gefindet the kahetet of them, it's at the time of pekuach nefesh. And he found a leniency that it was inyan of pekuach nefesh. Und derid hat der Melech nit gehat ken gerig and covet. This person did not receive the proper honor from the king. The king didn't respect him. Und der zweiter, was für Malkes wenn kimle begavei, as if it nit ever sein kinisser, a viele when the return and covet the Melech. But the second yid that was sitting in this gathering, whose for Malka was certain that he would not transgress an Isser, even if this affects the honor of the king, business to this nefesh, even at the risk of his own life. Davke der yid had nit blazed it for Allah dem Chaim Melech. This was the yid that not only did not lose his grace in the eyes of the king, that Adirabah, on the contrary, for Malka alein bevatek when as cover the Malchus. For Malka forgoes his own honor, his own dignity. When it's allein matriach given to Mishamis Mar Yehuda, and he himself invests the effort to serve Mar Yehuda. He could have called in one of his attendants, one of his servants. Or to tell Mar Yehuda that he should go and do it. But when a guy sees a yid who has fear of heaven, that risks his life to be scrupulous in any form of Isser, then the guy considers this an honor, a royal honor, to serve this yid. Not just to serve him, to look after him, to help him with his own body. In all of the various different ways of doing this mitzvah perfectly. As you said before, that Yehuda was allowed to eat this esrig because it was pikuach nefesh. So to not eat it was a yidur mitzvah. And nevertheless, Malka was totally into it because he respected him, because he stood up for what he believed. Through this kind of conduct, that we don't allow ourselves to be affected by the world around us, but we stand up for what we believe is right, for what Torah tells us is right. This brings an end to Avodah Zarah. We bring to an end the idea of Avodah Zarah, of idolatry in the world. This brings to the ultimate time when the Eibusher will be the king on the entire world. May it be B'kar of Mamish.